A conversation with DPS Transition Manager Judge Steven Rhodes. The state gets blamed for the Flint water crisis and the impact of the Belgium terrorist attacks on the presidential race. Stay put. MiWeek starts right now.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015? It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
And welcome to MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. It has been another week of major news. A terrorist attack in Belgium, a stinging report from the Flint Water Task Force, and the continuing debate over a financial rescue package for Detroit public schools. We will offer viewpoints on all of these stories for you tonight. But let's start with Detroit public schools. The state Senate has approved a $715 million plan to bail out DPS, but the legislation faces a tougher battle in the House. DPS Transition Manager Judge Steven Rhodes is here to talk about finances and much more. And of course, we have our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, it's good to see you. Judge Rhodes, welcome to MiWeek. It's good to have you here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
All right. Before we start talking about everything finances with DPS, how the teachers are feeling and kind of where we go from here, you know, you retired from a very high-profile position and you presided over the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. And people would say that's probably one of the toughest jobs that you ever had. But now you stepped into this role as transition manager at DPS. What was the first phone call or first couple phone calls you got doing this? And what was the thought about even taking this job?
Well, the governor asked me to do it, and he can be very persuasive. And also, I was thinking about the children of the city of Detroit. I said when I confirmed the city's plan that the city itself would only succeed if the schools succeeded. And so there's work to be done with the schools, and since the governor asked me to, and I felt this was a further opportunity to contribute to the future success of the city, that this is something I should do.
So now you have parents now in Detroit Public Schools saying, all right, what's his management going to be any different than what we've seen from emergency management in the past 10 years? Mm-hmm.
That is a frequent question that I get, and I appreciate the question. There are two major differences. The first is that I view my role as a transition leader, and that's why I've asked to be called a transition manager rather than an emergency manager. And so the concept is to transition leadership of public education in Detroit from emergency management to local control again. I believe in local control. Unfortunately, we can't just flip the switch. There has to be a process, and so the governor asked me to lead that process back to local control, and that's the task that I embrace. The other difference is, in this process of transitioning to local control, I am committed to an open, honest, accessible, responsible process. I want everyone who has a stake in the future of Detroit education to be involved in this process to the extent they want to be. And I'm committed to that, and I'm involving teachers, parents, I want to involve the community. This has to be an open process. I believe in democracy, and this is the way to make democracy work between now and when we do return it to local control.
The bill that passed the state senate this week would have us have elections, school board elections in August. That board would take immediate control of the district. That's strange timing, though, for the school year. I mean, the schools would reopen in September. What are the things that you would have to do to make it possible for the first elected board in almost 15 years to have complete control of the district and be able to manage through what still is a pretty rocky time?
Well, probably the number one thing to do to set up the new district for success is to have a budget. And so we are working very hard on the budget for the next school year. Beyond that, of course, the budget that we are establishing needs to be a balanced budget. We cannot condone deficit budgets for the Detroit public schools any longer. It's that problem that got us where we are today. The legislation is essential to a balanced budget because we have been spending too much of our income on debt service.
Debt, sure.
Exactly. So those are the keys. Beyond that, bringing in Alicia Merriweather as our superintendent is a major step towards success of the Detroit Public Schools. And I intend to do what I can to set up the central office for success in the future as well.
Do you anticipate having to close more schools in the city by September?
We are examining that, but I'm a little bit conflicted there, Stephen, frankly. Closing schools is a very challenging subject. There are many factors that have to be considered, and of course there are the financial factors and the performance factors, but it has to be a process that involves everyone who is affected by potential school closings. I'm not sure we actually have the time to do that between now and the next school year. And more than that, I have this sense that that's a process that should be managed by the next school board, by the people who the citizens elect to be in charge of the school system.
So the legislature got out of town without approving the rescue package for the schools. They're gone on spring break. Is there enough time left now to head off the April payless paydays that you warned about?
We need approximately $50 million from the legislature in order to finish this school year. If that does not happen, then we will go dark after April 8th, and that's unfathomable. I don't know how we as a society can allow that to happen.
But it'll be almost April 8th by the time they get back and start deliberating again. So is there any other means of keeping these schools open without that money?
I've examined that question, Nolan, and I cannot ask the teachers to work without assuring them that I have the money to pay them. So I don't have a plan B.
So you'd shut down?
I don't have a plan B.
What has your experience been in lobbying legislatures to get the plan on board for DPS? Because as we see from the Senate plan, it's very far away from what the House has recommended in terms of looking at local control and looking at the Detroit Education Commission as well. What has your experience been in speaking with people in Lansing, and especially these lawmakers who are not in the Detroit area?
Well, the legislators ask very legitimate questions, and we hope we have been able to provide sufficient answers to them. I would say the number one question that they have is how can we be sure that this won't happen again in 5 years, 10 years, or whatever? And as I say, that's a very legitimate question. And what it comes down to is district leadership. We have to have the right leaders in place. And ultimately that becomes a question of trusting the voters in Detroit to make the right decisions when they go to the ballot box in electing school board members. And here I want to point out that when the legislature adopted and bought into the grand bargain that was such a key feature of the Detroit case, that was an expression of their support for democracy in the city of Detroit, their expression that they trust the voters of Detroit to continue to elect leaders who will make the right decisions to keep Detroit on the right path. And so now that we're here, we need to ask the legislature to reaffirm that trust in the voters of Detroit, in the judgments they make about school board leadership. there's no reason to believe we can't trust the people of Detroit. They've elected good leadership here in the city, and I trust that they will elect good leaders for the school board as well. That's what it comes down to. I've said it so many times, democracy is not a spectator sport. The people of the city of Detroit have got to take a proactive role in the management and leadership and direction of the schools of the city of Detroit.
Do you feel like once we get to the school board being back in charge of the district, if you can deliver them a balanced budget to begin work with, what's the prospect for that being successful going forward? I mean, the system still seems to be maybe losing kids, not as fast as it was before. As we talked about before, there are still these overcapacity issues. Are they being set up for failure again if we don't make dramatic changes?
I don't sense that at all, Stephen. I sense a new spirit, a new enthusiasm, a new energy about public education in Detroit. We have a very strong, dedicated, and committed group of teachers. These teachers are really the unsung heroes of public education in Detroit. They have endured for 5 or 6 or 7 years no pay increases. In fact, for many of them, more than 10% pay cut. So by just sticking around, they have demonstrated their commitment to these kids. And so my sense is that if we can eliminate the necessity to pay $1,100 per kid and put that back into the classroom, that public education in Detroit will be able to succeed, it will be able to compete, and will be able to win in that competition. Look, not only have our enrollment losses begun to decline, and very substantially so. Our graduation rate, which was just announced, has gone up dramatically and is now just short of the state average. And we have 7 high schools with graduation rates in excess of 90%, including one that was 100%, Davis Aerospace. So I sense a real turnaround in the kind of energy and enthusiasm that it's going to take to make the Detroit schools successful.
So you look at this district and the trouble it's been through, and the financial blunders it's made in the past, and under state management, the financial troubles it's endured. What sort of ongoing oversight will be appropriate for the Detroit Public Schools, which seems to be where the legislature is hung up on how much control they hang on to, or the state hangs on to, after it returns to an elected school board?
I think that a strong financial review commission is entirely appropriate, and especially so for schools. And why do I say that? There's a much overlooked provision in our Michigan Constitution, and it says that the legislature shall provide for the free public education of children in our state. That's an awesome responsibility that the Constitution puts on the legislature. It doesn't put it on the local school board, it doesn't put it on the city, it doesn't put it on anyone other than the legislature. So for me, the Financial Review Commission is one of the tools that the legislature has to help it fulfill its constitutional duties. So I support a Financial Review Commission, and I think that our experience with the City of Detroit Financial Review Commission has established, at least so far, that it can play a valuable role in the revitalization of the school system itself. So I support it.
When you leave this transition role, what would you like to see have done? I know that you have a contract that will go until September. That is, if the money comes through for DPS. When you step back from this role, what would you like to see achieved?
I plan to help people identify the strongest possible candidates to run for school board. In the past, it's been hard to motivate high quality, highly experienced people to serve in this position. But we need to turn that around. So I plan to work on that even while I'm in this role. And once I'm done, I plan to let the school board to run it, and I plan to get back to my personal plan from 3 years ago, which was to retire.
All right. Well, DPS Transition Manager and retired bankruptcy judge Steven Rhodes, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing how things transpire in the next few weeks.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Okay. Continuing our conversation now about Detroit Public Schools after Judge Rhodes has left us. I think it's very interesting, Nolan, that he's talking about one of his main jobs is also making sure that the right people or the best people for the job make themselves available to run for school board. Why is it so crucial to convince Detroiters that they are going to have a school board that's not of the school board of 20 years ago that people keep harkening back to?
Or even 10. I mean, it's vital that you have good, strong, solid leadership. This won't work otherwise. If we go back to the sort of school board we've seen in the past year, where we've had illiterates on the board, we've had perverts on the board, we have people who are self-interested. This has to be an independent, competent board. If it's in the pocket of the unions, it's not going to work. If the folks go back to handing out contracts, to friends and family, it's not going to work. That's how this district got in trouble in the first place.
Okay, but it's April now. It's April, and you're looking about having an election in August. So do you find the right people for the job?
I think the timeline here is nuts. The likelihood of you producing a crop of candidates that's going to be about the right things and can campaign and raise enough money to win at the ballot box is really low. I also have a sort of philosophical problem with the idea of this election. We have an elected school board in the city of Detroit. That board, its term is not just over in August. I mean, I'm not sure what mechanism we're even using to say, well, those people are dismissed. Now, a lot of those people are wackadoodle characters and whatnot, but they were elected by the people. And it's also true that they haven't governed. I mean, these are not the people who screwed up the district. They haven't been in control for a single day since they've been elected.
But they ran for a position knowing that they wouldn't be governing a single day.
But figuring that someday democracy would be restored, and people voted for them thinking that. I'm not sure you can just abrogate that election or those elections in favor of this new one. That doesn't seem like
if
the
you
right
don't,
thing
there's
to
no
me.
point in doing this, because then this district is gone. You've got to have good, responsible
So it's okay
leadership.
just to make up the rules?
And you have people out there. Sheila Cockrell and Irv Reed at Wayne State are working on trying to develop talent and to also educate the community on what qualities they're going to need in new school leaders. Leadership's going to be essential if this is.
But see, is it okay to make up the rules to do that and to say, well, the elections that took place just don't matter, we're going to wipe them out? I think there's a real problem.
I mean, if they're operating under the emergency management law, they've got broad powers to dismiss the school board.
But isn't that what makes people uncomfortable in the first place?
Yeah, no, they don't. The emergency manager law doesn't allow that. It doesn't allow the dissolution of elected bodies. This is all made up out of nothing. I mean, I think they're probably relying on the idea that they're creating a new district.
Well, it'll be in a new law, Steve. So I mean, they'll create the framework.
I have
for
a real
the
problem
new law.
with this.
All right, before we end our conversation here, I want to talk a little bit about these potential for payless pay days for the teachers, or the fact that Steven Rhodes said, I'm not going to ask the teachers to work if they are not going to get paid. And right now we still don't have movement for that supplemental funding, that about $48 million that the district needs. Do we need to have that day where teachers don't show up, the entire district is shut down, for any kind of more movement to come out of this?
Well, I mean, that's a disaster situation, and you talk about losing enrollment. I think that would really exasperate that problem. I would have preferred the legislature got that supplemental bill done, but that's just pushing the deadline down the road. They would have come back and then bargained again and stalled again until the next deadline came. There's huge philosophical differences on the how the district's going to be managed and operated going out of this, and how much oversight the state's going to have, and how much control this Detroit Education Commission is going to have to pick and choose which schools close and which schools open. And I don't see them resolving that in a hurry.
I don't see them resolving it in a hurry either, and I think the opposition here has got to be called out on what's going on. I mean, there's an awful lot of paternalism that's driving this idea that people, Republicans from outstate, know what Detroit and Detroiters ought to be doing with their schools. There is a lot of anti-union bias that's driving this. Somehow now unions can't operate in Detroit the same way they do in other school districts, and there's a racist component here. I mean, again, this is the way that we have treated Detroit as a state for a really long time. It's not a mystery or not irrelevant that it's the largest black-controlled city in the state. These guys ought to be ashamed of themselves for some of the stuff that they're saying and some of the stuff that they're doing. It's reprehensible, and we're not going to get anywhere as long as that's going on.
Do they go behind the excuse, Nolan, of, well, if you want our money, then you have to play by our rules?
Well,
it's their money.
It's not an excuse. I mean, they are committing a great deal of money, and that money, no matter where they say they're getting it, whether it's the tobacco settlement fund or bonds or what have you, that money is ultimately coming out of every other school district in the state. And so they have an obligation to their own communities and to voters across the state to put some oversight on that money.
We're not being given any money. This is money this is debt that they ran up. So the state's responsible for it.
It's still money coming out of the federal or the state treasury.
But to use that as predicate to punish Detroiters who had nothing to do with running up that debt is, again,
I don't think they're talking about punishment, but the
there's a
money's
lot of
going to have
doublespeak going
oversight
on here. It's absurd.
I mean, they're not just going to release that money and say, go ahead and
I don't think anybody would argue against having oversight.
Well, they certainly are. That's the dispute in the legislature.
Who ran up the debt?
now.
We didn't do it. They did.
Yeah, the debt. Come on, Steve. $2 billion of that debt was rocked
That's
up
not the debt.
before
But that's not the
state
debt that's
ever
being
took over.
relieved.
$2 billion was raised and backed by the state.
But they're not giving us that money.
To be spent on fixing the schools, and the schools never got fixed. And so there is some concern in the legislature about what happens to the money.
All right. Well, we'll have to see what happens now in this next week. And turning to something we can all not agree on, to the Flint water crisis. A new report by an independent task force appointed by Governor Snyder concludes the state is to blame for the lead contamination of the city's drinking water. The report places primary responsibility on Flint's emergency managers and the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. It recommends a review of the emergency manager law and the creation of a toxic exposure registry containing all of the people living in Flint over the past 2 years. So basically, they could have done one page and been like, everybody's screwed up, here's the report.
Or
but
one paragraph.
Really,
Or especially you, Governor, screwed
really
up and quit blaming
piled
everybody
on
else.
the state. Whereas there has been this conversation of the blame has to go around, and yes, the blame does go around, but
they
it
said
does
yesterday,
land squarely
They
on
said
the
yesterday,
state.
no. They said, quit saying that. Quit trying to disperse the blame here. Most of it sits with the Department of Environmental Quality, and that reports up to the governor. I mean, they were very clear about that.
The blame was widespread and deep, and basically what it said
Not what they
in the
say.
opening sentences that government failed at every level, and it did here. It failed. The feds failed. Certainly, we've been looking at the city of Flint as a victim here. Its officials screwed up from the very beginning, mismanaged from the very beginning. It was a colossal failure of government at every level, and a real example of how the bureaucratic culture just continues to foster this sort of attitude and culture. You talk several times about culture in these departments of, we don't really work for the public. We work for our own benefit.
I think it's interesting, too, that they looked at environmental justice in this situation, or called environmental injustice, and they also said that there should be a review of the emergency manager law coming out of what happened here.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that you could do to the emergency manager law to make it a little more transparent, to have better checks and balances over the decision making. They stopped short of saying this, but I think part of the implication here is also that the emergency manager law is a tool. It is not policy. And this is an administration that has used that law as the sum total of its urban policy since it's been in Lansing. There's a lot of other stuff that needs to be done with regard to the way we fund cities, the way we allow cities to fund themselves and govern themselves, that goes beyond the emergency manager law, and Rick Snyder has been completely uninterested in any of that.
And look for our special on municipal finance coming soon to a television near you. You get a last word on this, Nolan. We got 20 seconds left.
The emergency manager work in Wayne County is a pretty good example. They empowered the executive, gave him the leverage he needed to get
It's a good example of that. Yeah.
It was representative government still, but it cleared away a lot of the obstacles he needed to make tough decisions and implement them. I think it worked perfectly there, and that serves as a good
Yeah, it's a good
example
example.
for the future.
All right, well, we did want to get to the terrorist attacks in Brussels and how that might be impacting the presidential race. We didn't have time for that. So we are going to keep on talking after the show tonight. So find us at MiWeek.org on Facebook and Twitter. You can get that extra segment. And as always, we appreciate your support for Detroit Public Television. That is going to do it for MiWeek tonight. I'm Christy McDonald. Meet us back here next Thursday for another edition of MiWeek. Take care.
Did you know? Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago. In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.